choose to go, you're already there. And if I go to the heavens, rise on the wings of dawn, if I settle by the sea, I know your hand is always there to guide me. You are there, you are there, you are there, you are there. Where can I go? Where can I go from your presence? Trouble is in my way, you're already there. You will not go. You will not go from my presence. Before a word of mine is said, if in the depths I lay my head, in the shadow of your wings you're there to hide me. You are there. 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 I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got my faith in the Lord. I'm so glad I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the love of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got my faith in the Lord. I'm so glad I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the love of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. 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 I've got the joy of the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord.
Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint and today we'll be in 1 Samuel chapter 17. We will be meeting today at the auditorium at 10 a.m. for assembly. Please join us if you can. Masks will be provided at the door for anyone who needs one. You're welcome to join us at 9 a.m. at the auditorium to see the Bible study on the large screen. We'd like to call your attention to this English Standard Version Bible from the World Bible School that we're making available. If you'd like to have one, please contact our church office. I'd like to take a moment to thank the AV crew, Gary, Sandra, Jeff, Jonathan, and Abigail, and many others who've helped from time to time. I appreciate it. David's often up there on the soundboard, and I appreciate that too. They've put in a lot of work learning the new technologies that we're having to incorporate for the streaming activities. Gary and Scott worked innumerable hours getting those early streams going, and I sure do appreciate the efforts that they put in. It's paying off now. We know a lot about what we're doing, and we're having some good luck keeping things from glitching out. And I think we've been able to put together some good material to keep on the internet available to anyone at any time. So give them a word of encouragement as you have opportunity. No word on the COVID-19 front this week. I haven't heard any updates, but we are happy to hear that the president is feeling better. Also, be on the lookout for April. She's been cleared to drive her car again, so she's going to be out and about. Protect yourself. As is our custom, we want to call into memory the events from the end of Luke, where the two men were on the road to Emmaus and they were joined by a third man. And while they were on the way, there was a burning in their hearts as they fellowshiped with this person who was in their party. When he left their party, that burning in their hearts disappeared, and they realized that was an indicator that man was the Christ in their presence. And how can we have that burning in our hearts? And I think we can also find a burning in our hearts when we join parties with Jesus through his word. We can find that in the New Testament. We can find evidence of it in the Old Testament. So open that Bible and study. Give time to meditation and consideration and reflection on the things we find in God's word to help us to move forward in a good spirit and fellowship with God to do good works in his name. Remember the admonition from Leviticus chapter 19 to be holy, for the Lord our God is holy. We need to do that, and we have to do that. In order to do that, we have to know what holiness is. We can find that example and description in the scriptures. So join with us now as we enter into this study today of 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you'll recall, last week we read the first few verses of chapter 17. We will pick up today in verse 19, where we left off with verse 18 last week. Today's reading will include violent scenes. Please consider this when showing this video in front of children. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 19. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Verse 21. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. Verse 24. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. Verse 26. And David said to the men who stood by him, What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, So shall it be done to the man who kills him. Verse 28. Now Eliab his eldest brother heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Verse 29. And David said, What have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another, and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. Verse 31. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." Verse 34. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him." Verse 36. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Verse 41. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield-bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Verse 46. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Verse 48. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. Verse 55. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son the boy is." And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." Okay, last week we read 1 Samuel chapter 16. In that chapter we saw Samuel grieving over Saul, having been present when the Lord issued a judgment against him following the events of chapter 15 among the Amalekites. The Lord had rejected Saul because of his behavior, and he asks Samuel why he's still grieving over Saul, and tells him to fill his horn and go and find Jesse the Bethlehemite and anoint a king from among his sons. So Samuel actually makes an excuse and says that he's fearful of Saul in doing just that and going out into the public. The Lord gives him a plan, tells him to take a heifer and make a sacrifice in that community, and to invite Jesse to that sacrifice, and he would show him what to do. So Samuel did what the Lord commanded in verse 4, and presented himself to that town, the Bethlehem. The elders greeted him with a question, "Do you come peaceably?" I find that humorous because of the events of chapter 15. I think they were a bit fearful of Samuel. Samuel responded and said he had come peaceably to offer a sacrifice, and he invites Jesse and his sons to attend. When Jesse and his sons show up, he goes through the sons one by one, and none of them are acceptable to God. God seems to be with Samuel as he's going through the sons and lets him know one by one that none of them are the one that he's looking for. Having gone through 7 sons, he says to Jesse, "Is there not another son?" Jesse said that there was, that he had an 8th son who was out keeping the flock. He tells Jesse to send for this 8th son and bring him in. And sure enough, when he comes in, Samuel's struck by his appearance. He's very striking in appearance, and he anoints him with oil according to the Lord's will. And it says in verse 13 that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. In verse 14, we see that the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit came from the Lord and tormented him. And it tells of this early relationship, apparently an early relationship, between Saul's household and David, in that Saul was advised by his servants to find someone to play a liar to comfort him while the harmful spirit was tormenting him. So they went out and found David, who was apparently known for being a good player of the lyre, and they bring him in, and he comes with an additional recommendation that he was not only skillful with the lyre, but a man of valor and a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, that the Lord was with him. So he comes into the household of Saul in this service and does these things on behalf of Saul when he is tormented. It says in verse 23 that Saul was refreshed and was well whenever David would play his lyre when the spirit had been tormenting him. We go on into chapter 17. We're introduced to this battle between the Philistines and the Israelites. It was an ongoing battle, apparently. Nothing new, and something that did not cease in the days of Saul, according to an earlier passage. But this day, as the battle lines were drawn up, a Philistine giant presents himself from among the ranks of the Philistines and makes a claim against the Israelites, saying that if they would send out a champion to fight with him, whoever would win between the two would serve as the determination of the battle. If the Philistine giant won, then the Israelites would be the servants of the Philistines, and vice versa. And he says that he defied the ranks of Israel that day in verse 10 to give him a man. Of course, there is also a description of this giant as being 6 cubits high and a span. There's another footnote here that in some translations or in some original texts, it's 4 cubits, which would put him in the order of a 6-foot high person, which would not necessarily be a giant among those people, although their stature was a bit shorter than the average today, according to people who keep track of that kind of thing. Anyway, continuing on, David was apparently home keeping the flocks that day, and Jesse told him that he needed to go and take some food to the 3 eldest sons who were in service to Saul as warriors in the battle line at the front. So David did this repeatedly for 40 days, and in that 40 days the Philistine continually came forward and challenged the Israelites in the same way as described earlier. And finally, in verse 17, Jesse sends David with some additional grain and loaves of bread to his eldest sons, and also some cheeses to the commander of the thousands that I'm assuming were charged with the eldest three sons. That's where we pick up in our reading today. It says in verse 19 that Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So fighting is a very loose term here. It's not clear at all that there was actually any physical engagement between the Israelites and the Philistines in any combative way. So there was two battle lines lined up. They were all under cover to some degree. Perhaps they were not that covered up from one another, but they were standing on opposite sides of a small valley, even at this point, and there was no necessarily any physical engagement between the people at this point. David, it says in verse 20, rose up early and left his sheep with a keeper, so he had taken care of the sheep, and took the provisions that Jesse had commanded him, and went to the encampment. And when he came to the encampment, he left the things that he had brought with the person who was in charge of the baggage, and ran out to the ranks, so the front line. So there was this front line where all the people were witnessing the Philistine running up and down, challenging the Israelites. So he must have heard some of that as he went, and he saw the people of Israel basically cowering in front of this Philistine giant. In verse 25, he was hearing the men of Israel say, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. So among the ranks of the Israelites, the word had gone out that Saul had offered this, basically a bounty, for anyone who was willing to go out and face this Philistine who was challenging them so. And the men of Israel were not standing up. They were not coming forward to do this thing. So David is hearing this talk among the men, and so he stops and asks them, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? So he asks the question, what is that again? What is this thing that's going to happen to the person who will do this thing? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God? So it was about God to David. David didn't think about the numbers of the Israelites or their necessarily physical inferiority or the lack of skill or weapons that might have been missing among the ranks of the Israelites. He thought the men of Israel, supported by the living God, were out here being challenged by this Philistine. Why were they being cowardly and not facing this Philistine? He didn't ask that particular question, but he went from person to person asking these questions among the men. Wherever he went, apparently, he got the same answer, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. Now, Eliab was apparently nearby and heard David asking people about this, and Eliab acts as the typical older brother in this regard, becomes angry with David for bothering people, apparently, assumes that he's nosing into stuff that he has no business nosing into, comes down and challenges David. Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. You've just come down here to see this. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? I haven't done anything to offend anybody. I'm just asking what everybody's talking about. And he turns away from Eliab and asks another, and the people answered him as before. So he's there, he's witnessing these things, and he's getting the same answer from everybody. They're not interested, but this is what the king's offering. Verse 31, David's words of inquiry reach the ears of Saul, and Saul sends for David. And David says to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul says to David, wait a minute, you're not able to go out and fight with this guy. You're but a youth. You've got no history. You've got no experience fighting and anybody experienced in war. And this man has been a warrior since his youth. But David says to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it from his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. So David had experience of fighting with wild animals who had been stealing from the flock. So he knew how to fight. He knew how to take advantage of the situation that presented itself and the way that he fought as well. And he claimed that he had fought lions and bears, and certainly this uncircumcised Philistine would be like one of those, for he has defied the armies of the living God. He says in verse 37, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul says to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So Saul gave up the argument and said, "Go on." Then, because apparently he wanted David to have a fighting chance, he gave David his equipment. He gave him his helmet and a coat of mail, and strapped his sword around David. And when David tried to use these things, it was unwieldy. He couldn't manage it. It was very heavy, and he'd not trained with the equipment, so he knew that these would be a hindrance and not a help. And he says as much, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." So he put them off, and he took his staff, and he took 5 small stones from the brook, it says in verse 40, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. He took what he knew how to use and went to fight the battle. And that's a good lesson. The Lord calls us to do a great many things, and we don't always feel that we're necessarily prepared, but when he calls us to a task and the task presents itself, he's prepared us enough to handle it. And perhaps we should do a lot less consideration of what our preparation is at that point, and more about going about and doing the work that we know how to do the way we know how to do it. There's always good time for preparation, and we should make preparation as we have opportunity. But when the battle's at hand, we need to go into that battle realizing that it's not us that wins the fight. It's the Lord that will deliver the fight into our hand. We don't need to be armed to the teeth. We don't need to be trained in the art of whatever battle it is we're facing. We need to depend on the Lord who will deliver us. The Lord will make the victory, not us. Be on his side, and we'll be victorious. David knew this was the case for him. He knew that the victory was with the Lord, and that the Lord was with the army of Israel. So when he went out with his preparation, he knew the victory was his before he even started. And it's interesting, in verse 41, we see the Philistine move forward, and he comes near David with a shield bearer in front. So he's got a shield bearer out in front of him, protecting him from any surprise that might have presented itself against him. David presents himself, and the Philistine looks at him and says, What's this? He was not pleased that it was such a young child, basically, who had presented himself as a challenger. He looked at his youth and his ruddiness and handsome appearance as detractors and not any evidence of skill. The Philistine responds to David's appearance by saying, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And he goes about cursing David by the gods of the Philistines. And he says, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." So David responds, you come to me with sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And that's a powerful statement. That's a more powerful statement than the statement that the Philistine would have made. And he says, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give you the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." So David makes his understanding of the situation clearly known. It's not the might of Israel's army that will save them that day. It is the Lord, the God of the Israelites, that will save them that day. And that's that's the answer. That's the way we should approach things. Devote ourselves to God, and when the battle comes, God will make the battle ours, not because of our strength, but because of our willingness to surrender to Him. But the battle's not done yet. So the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David in verse 48. It says, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. Now, I have wondered about this scene in my head for many, many years. Not long ago, they made a movie called Troy. And of course, that's not about this battle. But in that battle, Brad Pitt plays a certain character whose name fails me at the moment. But he engages in the battle, and that's the kind of the way that I envision this situation unfolds, racing toward the line of battle with great speed and eagerness. And that's apparently what David did. He crossed the field of battle to the point where he knew he was in range, and he reaches into his pouch and takes out a stone, and immediately it's in his sling and in the air and in the forehead of the Philistine. It strikes Goliath, and he sinks. It says it sinks into his forehead, and he falls on the ground. It sounds like face first on the ground. Now it says in verse 50 that David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him, and there was no sword in the hand of David. So that's the record. That's the kill of the Goliath with just a stone, no weapon of war to mention at all. But it's interesting because it states in verse 50 that he killed Goliath. But then it says in verse 51 that David ran and stood over the Philistine and took out his sword, meaning Goliath's sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. So it's entirely possible that the stone had not killed the Philistine, but had in fact disabled him to the point where he's effectively dead. But the killing blow was made with the Philistine's own sword by David as he cut the Philistine's head off. It says, goes on to say, the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, and they fled. And this is what's interesting, because if you recall the challenge of Goliath in verse 9 that we read last week was that if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. So the promise of the Philistine, Goliath, was not met by the Philistines. When David wins against Goliath, they did not surrender and serve Israel. They ran. So the Israelites pursued. It says they ran and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath, Goliath's hometown, and the gates of Ekron, and wounded many Philistines on the way from She'aram. I don't know how to pronounce that, but I've tried several different things off camera. As far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camp. So David takes the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put Goliath's armor in his tent. Now in verse 55, we kind of roll back a little bit in time, and it says that Saul saw David go against the Philistine, and as he was apparently going out to meet the Philistine, he asks Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner says, O king, I do not know. As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And he asks that they inquire whose son the boy is. But when David returns, and it's not very long after that David returns, after striking down the Philistine, Abner takes him and brings him before Saul, and it says that David still has his head, the Philistine's head, in his hand. And Saul asks him, whose son are you? And David says, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And that's the end of the reading. Certainly not the end of the story. It's an engaging story, certainly one we learn as young children. It's an incredibly violent story and graphic in detail. And that's why I put a little warning before we started the lesson. But it is amazing how many of these stories that we learned as children are incredibly violent and graphic in their nature. And we're not done. We're going to read more graphic elements of other natures throughout this book, so be forewarned. Before you show the study to children that there will be mention of graphic things as we move forward. It's important to remember that the Lord will be with us if we are the Lord's, and we should not be afraid to meet challenges that present themselves. That's why God has us as his children in situations to meet them, to show that there is a God, that there is a God who is in command of his church, and his church will not be prevailed against. We will prevail as members of his church, not by our own power or by our own hand, but by God's power, by God's hand. God will make provision for us to serve him and to show his will among the people of the earth. We're his messengers. We have to take the message. He's going to make sure it gets there. I hear the train. We are out of time. I hope that you've been able to be encouraged by this message today. We will have assembly today shortly, so please join us if you can. Don't come up here if you're sick. If you feel sick in any way, just stay home and enjoy the stream service. Have a great week. God bless.
My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God.
I will call upon the Lord.
I will call upon the
Who
Lord.
is worthy to be
Who
praised?
is worthy to be
So
praised?
shall I be saved from
Shall
my
I be
enemies.
saved from my enemies?
The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. Jesus Christ, he died for me,
Jesus Christ, he died for me.
and he took away my
He
sin.
took away my
I
sin.
will live with him for eternity.
I know the Lord liveth,
And blessed be the rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted.